True Crime Stories covered nearly 100 cases in 2024 alone. That's nearly 100 families torn apart, 100 victims whose lives were either lost or permanently changed for the worse. But out of all of these cases, there are 5 that stick out to me the most, either because they were particularly gruesome or because of the massive impact they left behind. No victim should be forgotten. And these 5, well, they'll probably keep you up at night. Many people don't realize this, but Australia is home to over 10,000 beaches spread across over 50,000 kilometers of coastline. Over 85% of Australians live by the beach. The beaches of Australia are prime tourist attractions. Gazing at the clear blue water, breathing in the fresh and salty air, and feeling the golden and warm sand beneath your feet sounds heavenly to most people. But for the Cordingley family, the beach isn't an emanation of serenity, freedom, and beauty. Rather, it's a horrific reminder of a crime that left them scarred with pain and despair forever. 24-year-old Toyah Cordingley was minding her own business walking along the shore of the quaint and secluded Wangetti Beach, approximately 38 miles away from her hometown of Cairns, with her dog, Indy, on a sunny afternoon of October 21st, 2018. But afternoon turned to night, and Toyah never returned home. Alarmed, her loved ones searched for Toyah first thing the next morning, hoping that she was safe. But what they tragically found was Toyah's lifeless body. Everyone in Cairns was plagued by horror and disbelief after Toyah's ill-fated end. But questions were looming over everyone's head. Why was Toyah attacked? Who was her attacker? And what led to such a horrible incident? The case of Toyah Cordingley is shocking and downright depressing, and while Australia may be thousands of miles away for many of us, it's a case that hits too close to home for most. If you're watching this video, that means you're probably interested in true crime. And if you're interested in true crime, then I'd be willing to bet you'd be interested in this channel, True Crime Stories. So do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button below. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my future cases. Toyah Jade Cordingley was born on June 14, 1994, to parents Troy and Vanessa in Cairns, Queensland, along Australia's northeastern coast. She was the only child of her parents, and the family of 3 had a good life. But not for long. See, when Toyah was still very young, her parents got divorced. Even though Toyah's parents loved her to bits, their marriage wasn't working out. Troy went on to marry a woman named Mary, and Vanessa married a man named Darren Gardner, and they went on to have 2 more children, Jack and Lena. Even though divorces can have a significant impact on the child involved, Toyah didn't seem to mind. If anything, she was excited to be a part of 2 families. So she was adjusting really well to her family's new dynamic. She even had a great relationship with her step-siblings, and everyone loved the vibrant and cheerful Toyah. Family and friends defined Toyah as carefree and adventurous. She had a warm and loving personality, and she was the person who said yes to new adventures. Toyah loved fairies and anything mystic, and she was very outgoing with her style, especially her hair and her clothes. Toyah changed her hair frequently. Sometimes she would have bright pink hair, other times it would be purple, and sometimes fire engine red. In October of 2018, though, Toyah was sporting an icy blonde hair color. Toyah's parents were no different either. They were unapologetically expressive with their styles. Sleeves of tattoos, funky hairstyles, and an alternative approach to life were things that were normal for the Cordingley Gardner family. All in all, Toyah and her family weren't afraid to freely express their style. Toyah also adored animals, so much so that she took up a job as a kennel attendant at a Paws and Claws refuge and boarding center in Port Douglas. Her love for animals can also be seen in her last social media post, which was in October of 2018, reading, quote, "No matter how talented, rich, or intelligent you are, how you treat animals tells me all I need to know about you." And I couldn't agree more. Paws and Claws counselor Michael Kerr defined Toyah as a beautiful, loving soul and a loyal employee. According to Michael, Toyah could calm down the most aggressive of dogs within minutes, and that was just a gifted quality of hers. Not long after, Toyah did start a new job, working in a pharmacy called Whole Life in Earlville, a suburb of Cairns. But her heart was still with animals. so she continuously volunteered with animals and even kept lots of pets. Toyah was also in a 2-year-long relationship with a guy named Marco, and the two bonded over their love for animals, especially dogs. Marco and Toyah also had the same goals in life, and the two were head over heels for each other. Toyah's family was over the moon for her, as she was finally with a guy who made her genuinely happy. The couple also had a dog, a German Shepherd Mastiff and Great Dane mix, named Indy, who was essentially a gentle giant. Toyah and Marco moved in together with their pets, and life was perfect for them. But this would all change in the most heartbreaking way on October 21st, 2018. The Cordingley family would be struck with something so unexpected and so tragic. Sunday, October 21st, 2018, started out just like any other day for Toyah. She had some errands planned, and one of them was to take her dog Indy out for a walk on One Jetty Beach, about 38 kilometers north of Cairns, roughly halfway between it and Port Douglas. She worked her shift at Whole Life Pharmacy, handing out camel milk samples to customers. And yes, you heard that correctly, camel milk. You learn something new every day, I guess. Anyway, after work, Toyah made her way to Rusty's Market, which was close to the waterfront, to pick up some produce for dinner that night. And she was actually seen on CCTV footage between 12 and 1 p.m. carrying a colorful basket donned in a light blue crochet top with her hair up. After her trip to Rusty's Market, Toyah returned home and informed Marco about her trip to the beach with Indy. She left the house at about 2:30 p.m. with Indy and made her way to One Jetty Beach in her 2009 blue Mitsubishi Lancer. She parked it near the southern entrance of the beach, and then it's assumed that she went for a walk on the beach with Indy. One Jetty Beach is a remote shoreline, with 4 kilometers of coastline and no facilities apart from a parking lot and the highway. The beach is known as a local secret, and it's very quaint. But Toyah would never make it back home for dinner. When hours passed and afternoon darkened into evening, Marco started to worry about Toyah, as she wasn't answering her phone and wasn't home yet. At 9 p.m., Marco called Jack, Toyah's stepbrother, and asked if she was there with him, as she still hadn't returned home for a very long time. Jack was also immediately alarmed, as Toyah hadn't come to visit him, and he went straight to his mom, Vanessa's room, who was getting ready for bed at that time. As soon as she heard the knock and saw her son's visibly nervous and shaken demeanor, Vanessa felt in her gut that something was wrong. Jack went on to tell Vanessa that Toyah was gone since that afternoon, and no one could reach her. The police were immediately contacted, and 24-year-old Toyah was officially reported missing at 10:50 p.m. Vanessa even called Troy, her ex-husband and Toyah's dad, and together, along with friends and family, they started looking for Toyah in their neighborhood and even spread word across social media. The police suggested that they look for Toyah in the morning because One Jetty Beach was essentially a pitch-black pit of sand and water at that time, and with the high tide, it was impossible to find anything, and it could have even been dangerous for searchers. While the police's suggestion was reasonable, Toyah's family was eager to start their search as they wanted to find her immediately, no matter what time of day it was. But without having any luck during the evening, the investigators and Toyah's family eventually agreed to look for her first thing in the morning. The 22nd of October rolled around, and early in the morning, Toyah's family, armed with flashlights, went to One Jetty Beach where they found something that bloomed hope in their fearful hearts. It was Toyah's car. It was still parked there, but there was no sign of Toyah. But the family was relieved at that moment because it meant that Toyah hadn't left the beach and gone somewhere else. When the group made it to the shore, the tide was still high, although there was still no sign of Toyah. But Vanessa did find something, or someone. Vanessa's eye wandered towards a bush, and she felt as though something was moving behind it. When she made her way towards it, she saw Indy, Toyah's pet dog, tied to a tree so tightly that it was unable to sit down. This clearly wasn't done by Toyah. She was a die-hard animal lover and put her pet's comfort before anything else, so it would have been impossible for Toyah to tie Indy's leash so unbearably tight. Troy and Vanessa freed Indy by cutting the leash, and Vanessa made her way to the car to charge her phone, since it had now run out of battery. This was probably a divine sign, because as the sun started to rise and the tide began to wash away, Troy made a horrendous discovery that no mother or father should ever have to witness. See, when the tide slowly retreated, Troy noticed something poking out of the sand. As he approached closer, his mind registered what he was looking at. It was a human foot. About 800 meters away from where Toyah parked her car at 7:45 a.m., Her body was tragically discovered by none other than her father, buried in a shallow grave. The sight of his only child in such a terrifying state is forever burned into Troy's mind. Toyah was disrobed and had sustained violent injuries, possibly from a knife. Vanessa was informed of her daughter's discovery and tragic passing by Jack, her brother, and she was struck with shock and disbelief, and then unadulterated horror and grief. Her 24-year-old, life-loving daughter had been taken away from her in such a tragic way, and she couldn't do anything but cry. Vanessa, because of how grave Toyah's injuries were, wasn't even allowed to see her daughter as she was being taken away from the beach. It's so harrowing for a parent to go through this. Troy and Vanessa knew that their lives would never be the same again. The Queensland detectives also had some things to worry about, and primarily it was who attacked Toyah, and was it someone that she knew, or was it a random attack? The city of Cairns was shocked by Toyah's unfortunate passing, as she didn't have any enemies and was the kindest, gentlest person anyone knew, and they were scared that the perpetrator was still out there, and no one knew who they were. Even though Wanjeti Beach was a beautiful place to visit, it wasn't the safest place for women. This sandy beach had an uncomfortable history that made it unsafe. See, there were multiple occasions when girls and even young women, including Toyah's best friend Megan, had gone to the beach for a fun getaway when they saw random men peering out of the bushes watching them. Some of the incidents were downright indecent and uncomfortable for the girls because men would disrobe and perform inappropriate acts right there in front of them. This string of incidents left girls and women with no choice but to flee the scene in obvious discomfort and fear. Since it was a remote place surrounded by bushes, shrubs, and a highway, Wanjeti Beach became a hotspot for predators and vile people. To be at this beach in the presence of friends was bad enough, but when you consider that Toyah had been completely alone that day, aside from her dog, well, the story speaks for itself. So the question was, is this what happened to Toyah? Did one of these predators manage to grab her and do the unthinkable? Amidst the investigators trying to uncover clues that could lead to answers for the grieving Cordingley family, Toyah's funeral was held on November 2nd, 2018, and hundreds of people flocked to say their final goodbyes to a bright young woman whose life was tragically and unexpectedly cut short. What was so heartbreaking was that Marco, Toyah's boyfriend, attended the funeral with Indy, who was with Toyah on the day that she was tragically attacked. I know a lot of people joke about what if dogs were able to talk, but in all seriousness, if there were ever a time for a dog to be able to speak up, it would be right now. Indy likely saw the entire attack from beginning to end, and those memories are simply etched into that dog's mind, never to be released. At the end of the funeral, Toyah was laid to rest with freshly picked flowers, surrounded by the people that she impacted so deeply. Meanwhile, the investigators taped off the beach, and divers and canine units were called to find any traces of another person that could be Toyah's killer. DNA testing, surveillance footage, forensics, witness reports, everything was checked by police. They even checked cell tower activity on the day and time that Toyah was at the beach. The detectives also had obvious suspects at the time of the crime, including Toyah's boyfriend Marco and her stepdad, Darren. But they were both soon ruled out because not only did they have airtight alibis, but it didn't make much sense as to why any of them would want to hurt Toyah. Moreover, there was another very confusing part about this whole case, and that was the question, why was Indy unharmed? Usually, when an evil person commits heinous crimes, they unfortunately don't leave pets unscathed. But to investigators, Indy's survival meant that the perpetrator was possibly someone Toyah and Indy both knew, which could explain why the dog didn't attack when Toyah was nabbed by her assailant. But it was soon found out that Indy was an obedient dog by nature, and even though his size would make people run for the hills, Indy was affectionate towards even strangers. So the idea of Indy being willing to tear down Toyah's attacker, well, it seems fairly unlikely. Anyway, the investigation was massive, and even included alternative and voluntary DNA testing of residents living near the crime scene, so that investigators could shrink their suspect list down. Investigators also looked at cars driving down Captain Cook Highway. And finally, after 6 months of combing through all the footage and cell tower details, the investigators had a suspect. They found him based on dashcam footage, geolocation, and a bizarre car that was seen swerving down the highway that overlooked the beach on the same day Toyah went missing. When police ran the plates, they came across two very shocking things. First, the car wasn't registered to the area where it was seen, so it could have been someone who was simply visiting One Jetty Beach. But the second detail was more alarming, and it was that the person who owned the car left Australia on the day of Toyah's disappearance, taking a flight to India. This was alarming for investigators because now catching the perpetrator was going to take a cross-continent effort. But who was the man, and what was his connection to Toyah? As police honed in on their primary suspect, they revealed that he was a 34-year-old Indian man named Rajwinder Singh. He made the move from India to Queensland years ago and was currently working as a geriatric nurse in a hospital about 90 kilometers south of Cairns. When the detectives visited the hospital where Rajwinder worked, coworkers remembered him acting weird and closed off a couple of weeks before the 21st of October. Rajwinder was apparently suffering from depression and chose to stay in his own company for the most part. He never really got out much and didn't associate with his coworkers outside of work. But this didn't sound alarming at first. Sometimes people just prefer to keep to themselves. But the police made their next stop, which was none other than Rajwinder's home. Unsurprisingly, they didn't find him there, but rather his wife and 3 children, one of them being a newborn. According to Rajwinder's wife, he left Queensland coincidentally on the 21st of October, heading for Sydney. There, he stayed with his sister for the night before catching the flight to India. Rajwinder's movements and hasty actions further solidified the investigators' suspicions. But there was more. When police talked to the witnesses, they stated that Rajwinder's face, neck, and even his hands were littered with scratches and bite marks, which is very concerning. Australian investigators knew that they had to work together with Indian law enforcement to track down Rajwinder and extradite him back to Australia to face the law, because these wounds he'd sustained had almost certainly come from Toyah. At least this was the theory detectives were operating under at the time. But it wasn't going to be easy to track this man down, and from that point onwards, a long and brutal waiting game began for Toyah's family, which was frustrating but inevitable. Extradition processes can take a lot of time to reach completion, because you're talking about 2 countries coming to the same page regarding the presented evidence to catch a criminal. It can essentially be a court case in and of itself, and we all know how many years court cases can take to reach a conclusion. Even though Australian police knew that Rajwinder was in India, after confirming with Indian detectives, things weren't going to be smooth sailing. The Australian government wanted to present rock-solid evidence against Rajwinder, which they had in the form of DNA found at the crime scene, and they didn't want to scare Rajwinder away because he seemed to have a tendency to flee when things didn't go his way. The process of making a brief of extradition took Australian law enforcement almost 2.5 years. All the while, Toyah's family was growing impatient by the slowness of the law, as they wanted justice to be served for their innocent daughter, who unknowingly and possibly became a victim of Rajwinder. But as the brief was sent in, nothing was really done. Indian investigators still needed to find Rajwinder, which was easier said than done. The local authorities in Australia even offered up a massive $1 million reward for information leading to Rajwinder's arrest. Thankfully, the promise of money worked, and less than a month later, a significant tip came in that would lead police right to Rajwinder. According to the person who gave the tip, Rajwinder was now part of a religious group. He wore a turban, had grown a long beard, and had lost a lot of weight too. Essentially, from what we can gather, Rajwinder was trying to blend in with the crowd, which is so infuriating to know that he knew good and well that he was a wanted man. Moreover, the person also gave detectives a crucial piece of information that would ultimately lead to them catching and arresting Rajwinder. See, he was about to visit New Delhi in a couple of days for a doctor's appointment, and the detectives knew that this was their only chance. Finally, on November 25th, 2022, 4 years after Toyah's disappearance and subsequent passing, 38-year-old Rajwinder Singh was arrested in New Delhi and held in a jail cell awaiting extradition. Surprisingly, he soon confessed to the crime in front of an Indian court. When asked about the motive, the answer he gave was vague yet terrifying. According to Rajwinder, on the 21st of October, he apparently got into a heated argument with his wife and left for Cairns to cool down. He oddly had a kitchen knife with him at that time, and once he reached One Jetty Beach, he sat on the sand, cut up some fruit, and was enjoying some peace and quiet. This was when he heard a dog barking at him. This was sadly Indy, who was with Toyah. The incessant barking angered Rajwinder to no end, and he started yet another argument, but this time with Toyah. During the argument, Rajwinder, in a rageful haze, pulled out the kitchen knife and launched a vicious and frenzied attack on Toyah. It's speculated from the injuries that he sustained that Toyah fought for her life, but Rajwinder overpowered her and tragically, Toyah lost her life in the end. What was so harrowing was that the only witness to this horrific scene were Toyah, Rajwinder, and Indy, whom Rajwinder tied to a tree after burying Toyah's body in a shallow grave, and then fled the scene. It's so unbelievable that Toyah lost her life at the hands of a man that she didn't even know. She was simply walking on the beach with her beloved dog when she crossed paths with an unstable Rajwinder, who mercilessly attacked and ended her life over such a minor issue, which I don't even know if you can call it that. It's just a dog doing what dogs do, bark. It's essentially normal behavior. Toyah lost her life for literally no reason at all. On January 24th, 2023, the Delhi court approved the extradition of Rajwinder Singh on February 28th, and he flew from Delhi Airport to Melbourne Airport to face prosecution for ending the life of 24-year-old Toyah Cordingley. He was eventually charged with murder in March of 2023, and you would think that would finally be the end of it. But Rajwinder's defense was nowhere near done. May 1st of 2024, a pretrial hearing was held which opened a whole new can of worms. See, the court was presented with evidence that Toyah was in a secret relationship with a man named Tyson Franklin, a podiatrist, whom she met a few weeks before her passing. A series of text messages between Tyson and Toyah were also presented by the defense in court. In the messages, Toyah confided in Tyson about how Marco was, quote, angry at the world, and that those emotions had been projected onto her. Tyson even appeared in front of the court and stated that he and Toyah had chemistry. Tyson also confessed that he was in contact with Toyah via text until her passing, and that Toyah told him that she was considering moving to a new place by herself. Shockingly, Tyson was questioned by the investigators at the time of Toyah's disappearance, although he conveniently left out the part about him and Toyah secretly seeing each other. But he confessed to them being involved with one another in court during a cross-examination. Now, it's unclear whether Toyah was actually seeing someone else besides Marco, her boyfriend of 2 years, or if this was just a ploy by the defense to deter the actual course of the case. While Tyson and Toyah certainly were friendly with one another, I wasn't able to find any concrete proof that the two were romantically involved. The reason I tend to believe that they weren't is because Toyah's plans for the future. For example, moving out on her own. She didn't seem to include Tyson in this. She strictly said that she wanted to get away from Marco for a while and nothing else. Regardless, this revelation has brought about some new opinions on Toyah's case. The vast majority of people still believe that Rajwinder Singh is responsible for Toyah's death, as his fleeing the country following Toyah's demise was very dodgy considering that his wife just gave birth to a newborn child. He'd sustained mysterious injuries, his car was seen at the area at the time Toyah disappeared, and he also confessed to the crime, although he later recanted this confession. On top of that, he even tried to change his appearance to blend in with the crowd, all of which is highly suspicious. But there's another opinion of some people that Rajwinder Singh wasn't the one to attack Toyah. Rather, it was someone close to her. This opinion points fingers at either Marco or Tyson. Some believe it's possible that Marco took Toyah's life because he found out about Tyson. But again, there's no evidence to suggest that Toyah and Tyson were romantically involved. Also, Marco was cleared as a suspect very early on, and Tyson didn't seem to have any ill will towards Toyah whatsoever. So Tyson can't be put at the crime scene either. There are so many unknowns in this case, and unfortunately we'll have to wait for the trial to find out how all of this really unfolds. Speaking of the trial, as of the most recent updates, Rajwinder's trial for Toyah's murder has been delayed to February of 2024, after his attorney, Angus Edwards, applied for an adjournment at the pretrial hearing held on July 19th of 2024. The reason for the adjournment was that the defense team needed time to go through heaps of evidence to properly represent Rajwinder and his involvement in Toyah's passing. The Cordingley family is finally at the point where they feel like justice will be served for Toyah. After spending 6 long years waiting for updates on Toyah's case, the painstakingly lengthy extradition process, and the eventual extradition of Rajwinder, well, it's taken a toll on the Cordingley family. They've lost faith in the Australian justice system, all the while facing harsh criticism from the people around them. Toyah's mom, Vanessa, expressed her sadness at a certain group of people in the community who brutally judged the family and their so-called alternative lifestyle. It's just so heartbreaking that an already bereaved family is being constantly bombarded with such cruel words just for being themselves. I'm telling you, across the globe, we seem to live in a culture that constantly preaches about equality and inclusion. We keep seeing all these different movements and hearing all these statements from people who are constantly preaching about equality. But let's be painfully honest. People only want equality for those whose lifestyles align with their own. That's the God's honest truth. The fact that people are badgering Toyah's family just because they're a little unusual, shame on you. The case of Toyah Cordingley may be well on its way to closure, but it's not there yet, and this is what makes everything so unfulfilling and disheartening. Toyah was a young and vibrant woman who had her whole life ahead of her, but everything she had planned for her future crumbled, and she never got to live her life to the fullest. Toyah's family is not even close to moving on with their lives. With Rajwinder's trial due in February of 2025, the Cordingley family is counting down the days until they can finally move on to the road of healing from this irrevocable loss. If Rajwinder is the person who snuffed the life out of this innocent and unsuspecting young woman, then this is so frightening. To think that you can randomly cross paths with someone so volatile and unstable is just beyond eerie. This case is a shining example that danger can be found literally anywhere. Broken, disturbed people are walking among us, and we probably pass by multiple people like Rajwinder Singh every single day without knowing it. We can only hope that the trial can hold answers for the Cordingley family, as well as the closure that they need to finally move on with their lives after experiencing such a perpetual nightmare. According to FBI statistics, only 51% of homicides are solved, and that means that nearly half of the homicides taking place in the United States are left unsolved, leaving the affected families with no closure and no answers. In Massachusetts alone, out of a staggering 10,000 homicide cases, 4,000 remain unsolved to this day. Another case that also comes from Massachusetts is one of 16-year-old Molly Bish. Molly was a lifeguard at Commons Pond, and she was spending her summer monitoring kids during their swimming lessons. But on June 27, 2000, just after a week into her dream job, she vanished without a trace. Molly's disappearance shook the close community of Warren, Massachusetts, and everyone was left in fear, disbelief, and terror. The case of Molly Bish is disheartening and tragic beyond measure, and even 24 years after her disappearance, some questions still remain unanswered. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I post new true crime cases every single week. So if you want to see some good old-fashioned true crime documentaries narrated by yours truly, hit that subscribe button. It's totally free, and it'll keep you up to date with all of my future videos. But Molly Ann Bish was born on August 2nd, 1983, to parents Maggie and John Bish. Molly was the youngest of 3 children, and the family of 5 lived in Detroit, Michigan. But something very frightening happened that caused the Bish family to relocate. See, in the Bish's old neighborhood, a woman had been abducted while coming home from work, and later, her lifeless body was found. This incident prompted the Bish family to make the move from Michigan to Warren, Massachusetts. Warren is a small and quiet town with a population of just under 5,000 people. The neighborhoods in Warren are safe, and in a small town like this, the community was tight-knit, and almost everyone knew everyone. This, according to the Bish family, was the perfect environment for raising their kids, John Jr., Heather, and Molly. Even as a child, Molly had a personality that made her extremely lovable. She was outgoing, kind, and had a quirky sense of humor that added more layers to her fun and endearing personality. Being the youngest, everyone, including her siblings, loved her. Molly's parents and siblings were very protective of her, and they adored her to pieces. Molly, at the time of the events, was also in a relationship with her high school classmate, Steve Lucas. Even though Molly was the apple of everyone's eye, she was extremely smart. She excelled in school and was a model student. She was passionate about one more thing, though, and that was sports. She was an outdoorsy girl who loved to play different sports, and she even played soccer and basketball in high school. She loved nature and was extremely athletic. Her athletic nature led her to follow in her brother, John Jr.'s footsteps, and she trained to become a lifeguard. John had been a lifeguard for almost 3 years at Commons Pond and had a lot of experience. This was perfect because Molly had the best teacher, and he walked her through the training. Being a lifeguard was the perfect job for Molly. It combined two things that she loved most: being outdoors and nature, and children. Molly, aside from being athletic and sociable, also loved children. In fact, Molly had dreams of working with and for children, and she wanted to pursue a degree of education in college after she graduated from high school. But becoming a lifeguard wasn't going to be a cakewalk. She had to work hard to earn her certification, but luckily she had her brother by her side, and after putting endless determination and efforts towards her goal, Molly finally got what she wanted. Molly got a job as a lifeguard on June 19th of 2000, where she would supervise children in swimming and other activities during the summer at Commons Pond. Commons Pond is a large pond, and it's essentially a recreational area in the residential and kind of central part of Warren. The pond is also surrounded by a man-made beach, which is the perfect place for Warren residents and their families to enjoy a hot summer's day. In the summer, Commons Pond was a hot spot for numerous water-related activities for children, even swimming, and Molly was elated to finally start her new job. Molly's mother, Maggie, would drop her daughter off every single day just before 10 a.m., and saw Molly joyfully running to the pond to get started on her lifeguard duties. But 8 days into her job that Molly loved and enjoyed every moment of, Commons Pond would be known for something very horrific and tragic. And sadly, Molly would also become a part of this tragedy. The lively and carefree residents of Warren, Massachusetts were now plagued by fear and grief when something terrible happened on June 27th of 2000. June 27th of 2000 was not a happy day for Molly. She woke up at 9 a.m. to the news of her soccer teammate getting injured after she was hit by a car while riding her bike to work. Molly was overcome with sadness, and it was safe to say that her morning was not off to a great start. She was also running late for her lifeguard shift at Commons Pond, where swimming lessons were due to begin at around 10 a.m. Molly donned a blue swimsuit underneath her clothes, and Maggie drove her to work. On the way to the pond, Molly made a stop at a local convenience store to buy a bottle of water at 9:50, and CCTV footage actually caught Molly at the cash register. But no one could have anticipated that this would be the last sighting of Molly. Afterwards, Maggie and Molly drove to the police station to pick up a two-way radio, as Molly's job required her to reach out to emergency services or the detectives if an unfortunate swimming accident or situation ever took place. Also, the two-way radio was the only means of communication for Molly, as telephone service wasn't available at the Commons Pond. Finally, at around 10 a.m., Molly and Maggie reached the pond, and the mother and daughter said goodbye to each other. There was no one at the pond at that time aside from Molly, Maggie, their car, and a sand dumping truck near the beach. Maggie was relieved that she could leave Molly at the pond safely and drove back home. Maggie remembered Molly making a beeline for the beach to set her things up. And 10 minutes after Maggie left Molly, parents started to arrive with their children for the swimming lessons. But there was no lifeguard. Molly was nowhere to be seen. When a mother of one of the children made her way to the lifeguard station, she saw that a first aid kit was open. Molly's bag was on a bench, her towel was spread over a chair with a pair of sandals neatly placed in the sand by the chair, along with an untouched water bottle. The mother assumed that Molly had skipped work and went out with friends, so she rummaged through Molly's bag to retrieve a whistle and kept an eye on the kids who were swimming. But at around 11:44 a.m., when Molly was still missing, the Commons Park Commissioner, Ed Fett, called investigators to let them know of Molly's disappearance. But the Warren Police Department weren't too worried at that time. They thought that Molly had run away or skipped a shift in rebellion to hang out with friends. As 1 p.m. rolled around, and there was still no sign of Molly though, the police notified Molly's mom, Maggie, and her sister Heather of Molly's disappearance. Maggie and Heather were shocked, and they had a very bad gut feeling that something was wrong. They went to the police station, understandably frantic, and the investigators tried to calm them down, but they were still sticking to their runaway theory, claiming Molly would most likely be home very soon. But this is true crime stories, and we all know this is not what happened. Maggie and Heather were completely unconvinced, and they stressed that Molly would never do such a thing. Molly was a responsible young girl and she would never skip a shift on a whim. Also, Molly's shoes, a pair of flip-flops, and her bag were left at the pond, so it was very unlikely that she would have run away barefoot and without any of her belongings. Molly's fears were solidifying, and the family started to search on their own, asking Molly's friends, teammates, and even her boyfriend Steve if she had visited them. But no one had seen or heard from Molly. 16-year-old Molly Bish had disappeared, leaving behind all of her belongings and a lot of confusion for her family and friends. After much persuasion from the Bish family that Molly hadn't run away, the Warren Police Department started to take Molly's disappearance a little more seriously, although they made another terrible mistake. See, the police didn't tape off the area where Molly went missing. Commons Pond was still open to the public after Molly's disappearance, and the flock of people around the potential crime scene tampered with any evidence that might have been left behind. Worse yet, Warren is a small community, and the detectives had little experience in missing person cases. So the Warren investigators collaborated with the Massachusetts State Detectives in their search for Molly. Initially, the Massachusetts State Police suggested that Molly might have tragically drowned in the pond, which her family refuted at the time, as Molly was an excellent swimmer. Also, if she lost her life in the pond, wouldn't you assume she'd been found pretty soon afterward? I mean, these kids were showing up to swim within minutes of Molly's disappearance, so this theory didn't even make any sense. Still, dive teams as well as volunteer groups on boats were sent to search the pond for Molly, but nothing came up. After hours of searching, the surrounding woods were also searched, but there was no sign of Molly or any clue that could lead anywhere. Detectives called off the search until the next morning, as it was getting dark, and on June 28th at 6 a.m., an even larger search mission was conducted. The search for Molly was the biggest and most expensive missing person search in all of the history of Massachusetts at this time. But even though everyone was looking everywhere for Molly, the results were unfruitful. The investigators did suspect Molly's boss and her boyfriend at one point, but they were soon ruled out as potential suspects, as they had airtight alibis, and from the looks of it, they were deeply concerned for Molly. The detectives also searched the path leading to a nearby cemetery, which was a secluded area surrounding the pond. Police thought that Molly's abductor had lured her under the pretense of being injured, since Molly's first aid kit was opened at the pond, and Molly may have then been tragically snatched. This was never proven, but this is a very likely theory. But there was one more thing that was brought to the police's attention, and that was a bizarre and chilling incident that took place a day before Molly went missing. What was even more insane about this incident was that Molly's mom, Maggie, witnessed it, and her statement would lead to one of the only tangible clues in this case. On June 26th, Maggie dropped off Molly at Commons Pond as normal. But as soon as she pulled up in the parking lot near the pond, Maggie saw a man. He had a mustache and was sitting in his white car, smoking a cigarette. He was parked pretty close to where Molly's lifeguard station was set up. But what made Maggie's skin crawl was how he was staring at Molly. Maggie defined this unknown man's intense gaze as terrifying. He was staring at Molly the entire time. This frightened Maggie, and she proceeded to accompany Molly all the way down to her lifeguard post and even helped her set up her station. Maggie thought that the weird man would go away by the time she reached the parking lot, but when Maggie approached the car, he was still there. Maggie was extremely disturbed by this man's presence, and she met his unnerving stare. To Maggie's shock and horror, the man locked eyes with her and kept staring at her, occasionally squinting his eyes and casually taking a pull from his cigarette. His face was stoic, devoid of any expression, and this left Maggie feeling scared and extremely uncomfortable. Maggie stated that she stuck around in the parking lot as she was terrified of this man and what he may do to her daughter, as he was lingering just a few feet away. This strange encounter took place the day before Maggie's disappearance. The police, who were left alarmed by this revelation, asked Maggie if she saw this man on June 27th, to which she answered in the negative. Maggie only saw a couple local businessmen dumping sand from a truck for the beach. This was why she felt that she could leave Molly on her own at the pond, as there was nothing suspicious about the two sand workers whatsoever. The businessman, as well as the sand truck driver, were also ruled out as suspects by the police, and they immediately focused their investigation on the strange but unknown man with a white car. They also asked people around the area, including the sand truck driver, and he said that he saw that same white car in the pond's parking lot, just minutes before Molly arrived for her lifeguard duty on June 27th. A worker at the cemetery also noticed a white car on the morning of June 27th. Shockingly, the path to the cemetery was very close to the swimming hole, and everyone suspected that this was the place where Molly was unfortunately abducted. There was another problem, though. The detectives didn't know what the strange man looked like, so they asked Maggie to define the man. And according to Maggie, he was an old man, maybe in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair. His eyes were dark and he had a mustache. Soon after, a composite sketch of the man was made, and it was made public to help catch the apparent abductor. But this single clue led to no solid leads. The Bish family didn't stop trying, though. They wanted to spread the word on Molly's disappearance, and they even made a website and an email chain system to reach out to thousands of people about any information on Molly. In an effort to refine the sketch of the man, Maggie contacted Gene Boylan, a famous sketch artist who may have helped get multiple high-profile cases solved. They met at a local bed and breakfast, and after 9 hours, Jean presented the final sketch, which she later tweaked by adding a cigarette on Maggie's request. Maggie thought that the sketch was identical to the man that she saw on June 26th. But even with this sketch, not a single one of the 1,000 tips received led to any breakthrough. Sadly, Maggie's case was hitting a brick wall over and over. But 3 years after the disappearance and abduction of Molly, something did surface, but it shattered the Bish family's hopes of finding their daughter alive. In the fall of 2002, a hunter was roaming through Whiskey Hill in Palmer, where he spotted a scrap of cloth. He didn't think much of it, and shockingly, a year passed before he told his friend Tim about his discovery. Tim immediately notified the investigators, and during an extensive search in the heavily wooded area, the piece of cloth was finally discovered. When detectives showed the cloth to the Bish family, Maggie immediately recognized it as Molly's blue bathing suit, the same one she was wearing on the day that she disappeared. The bathing suit was sent for DNA testing, while the 500 acres of wooded land was combed for more clues. Mind you, this was about 2 years after Molly had vanished. 6 days later, the DNA results came back and confirmed that the bathing suit did indeed belong to Molly. While a massive search of the area on Whiskey Hill was carried out on June 3rd, another human bone was found, belonging to someone between the ages of 14 and 20. And after testing it for DNA, it was unfortunately confirmed to have belonged to Molly. 6 days later, on June 9th, a total of 26 human bones were found from Whiskey Hill, which was 5 miles from Molly's house. All of the bones belonged to Molly, and it was concluded that Molly had lost her life. The police believed that the perpetrator had dug a shallow grave and buried Molly, and then her remains were dug up and scattered by animals in the woods. Due to the extensive degree of decomposition on Molly's remains, investigators were unable to determine the cause of her passing. All of these discoveries crushed Molly's family. Tragically, though, the discovery of Molly's body didn't lead investigators to the criminal either. Molly's abrupt abduction and inexplicable demise struck everyone in the quaint community of Warren. People were crestfallen about the young 16-year-old girl's passing, but their sadness was soon clouded by fear and horror, because whoever snuffed the life out of Molly was still out there, and no one knew who this person was. The Bish family laid Molly to rest on August 2nd, 2003, which would have been Molly's 20th birthday. Molly's family was devastated, and they bid farewell to a bright and cheerful girl with heavy hearts and tears in their eyes. Molly's birthday, a day that's supposed to be joyful, had turned into a day of grief for her family forever. But while Molly's case had gotten nowhere in the years following her disappearance and funeral, the Massachusetts detectives didn't back down. They wanted to find whoever targeted Molly on that fateful day of June 27th. Molly's case was highly publicized, featuring on 48 Hours, America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and Disappeared. The police also questioned a lot of people about Molly's disappearance and subsequent passing, as it was a full-fledged homicide investigation at that point. Violent predators, convicted assaulters, and criminals with disturbing rap sheets were questioned about Molly's disappearance. And after Molly's tragic passing was confirmed, detectives also came up with a criminal profile. They believed that Molly's murderer was a white male between the ages of 18 and 50 who had a violent criminal history, smoked cigarettes, and was familiar with the area where the crime took place. But the thing is, this could describe nearly 50% of the US population at the time of the crime. While this description was certainly a start, it was really nothing more than a shot in the dark. A number of suspects caught the police's attention. In 2005, a Connecticut man who was charged with attempted kidnapping in New York was under investigation in Molly's case, but there was no evidence to support that he was involved. Later in 2009, another suspect stood out to police. He was Rodney Stranger, and he had a grave criminal history. Rodney, a resident of Florida, was convicted of taking the life of his girlfriend who lived in Southbridge, Massachusetts, a few miles away from Warren, where Molly lived. Shockingly, Rodney matched the composite sketch of the strange man that Maggie saw. If that wasn't alarming enough, Rodney was actually living in Warren, Massachusetts at the time of Molly's disappearance, and even was fishing in Commons Pond quite often. He also went hunting in Whiskey Hill, where Molly's remains were later discovered. And to add to the oddness, Rodney had moved from Massachusetts to Florida a year after Molly's disappearance. Rodney's brother also owned a white Chrysler, which Rodney also drove occasionally, and when he was questioned, Rodney denied having any involvement in either of the young girl's disappearances, although he pleaded guilty to taking the life of his girlfriend. Rodney was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his girlfriend's murder, but he was not charged for Molly's case, as there just wasn't enough evidence for the court to convict him. And just like that, more years passed by with no breakthroughs in Molly's case. That was until November of 2011, when Detective Dan Malley named Gerald Battistoni, aka Confidential Informant Number 62 for the Eastern Hampton County Narcotic Task Force, as a possible suspect for Molly's abduction and demise. Gerald was also a very violent man who was arrested and was serving a sentence for continuously taking advantage of a young teenage girl in the 1990s. He had a lengthy criminal past dating back to the 1980s, and he also had frequented Whiskey Hill where Molly's body was eventually found. Gerald also matched the composite sketch, and he was a person of interest in Molly's disappearance. He even tried to end his life in prison after he was connected to Molly's case, which is highly suspicious. Molly's family asked for DNA testing, and Gerald's DNA was obtained by the Massachusetts State Police, but this lead also led to a dead end as Gerald passed away in November of 2014. There was never any other mention of the DNA they collected from him, so I think it's safe to assume it probably wasn't a match. On June 3rd of 2021, though, a new person of interest was brought forward to the district attorney, and it was Francis P. Sumner Sr., a registered offender. His criminal record was more than 20 pages long. He was arrested for aggravated assault and kidnapping and was given concurrent sentences of 15 to 18 years for the assault and 9 to 10 years for the kidnapping on July 9th of 1982. He was incarcerated at the Walpole State Prison and was released in 1997. So at the time of Molly's disappearance, he was out of prison and the detectives suspect he acted on his violent tendencies again. But the police couldn't question Francis Sr., because he was found lifeless in Massachusetts on May 4th, 2016, 5 years before he was even considered a suspect. But here's the thing. Detectives are now certain that he was the evil man behind Molly's disappearance and tragic passing, because they had, quote, new undisclosed information on him, which led them to investigate him. As far as the evidence takes us, Francis Sumner is our guy, but police aren't able to reveal much about him just yet, as the case is still under intense investigation. Revealing too much before police have definitive proof could potentially hamper this investigation. All they're saying for now is that Francis is, as far as they're concerned, the criminal. They just need a little more evidence to prove it. Investigators are trying to incorporate familial DNA testing to pinpoint whether Francis was involved in Molly's tragic end or not, by working with his son's DNA. But they still haven't been able to find any fruitful results, but all this information has only recently come out, so it'll likely take a little bit longer before this case can officially be classified as closed. "24 years have passed since Molly was last seen, and to this day, the case of 16-year-old Molly Bish remains open and technically unsolved, though obviously Francis Sumner is believed to be the man responsible. Unsolved cases are hard for the victims' families because they're constantly shown glimmers of hope and they expect closure, but it never comes, and they're left in this painful cycle of trying to get justice for what happened to their loved ones, grieving and hoping. Molly's family is agonized because they may never find out who drove their daughter straight into the hands of death. Whether Rodney Stranger, Gerald Battistoni, or Francis Sumner was responsible for Molly's abduction and ultimate passing, the Bish family can never see any of them facing any of the consequences because they've all already lost their lives and passed away. Where's the justice in that? It's just so chilling and scary to think that someone who abducted and led Molly to her tragic end never faced any consequences, at least not in this life. Molly's case is a horrific mystery and a real-life nightmare their family has to live with. Molly's family, from the moment she disappeared, spent all their time and energy trying to find Molly's abductor and killer, and they continue to do so 24 years after the tragedy. In 2004, not long after Molly was laid to rest, the Bish family founded the Molly Bish Foundation, which is a joint collaboration with Anna Maria College. It's an organization that spreads awareness on child safety and stresses on pushing forth laws that ensure timely and quick action for missing persons. The Bish family were left hopeless in the initial search for Molly, as police dismissed her disappearance as, quote, kids being kids or teenage rebellion. The Bish family believes that if detectives had worked seriously from the get-go, they wouldn't have wasted precious time in finding Molly, and maybe the circumstances would have been different. The Molly Bish Foundation has also provided training to first responders to ensure that missing person cases are not taken lightly, and that the action is immediate and effective. Moreover, Molly's sister Heather has also advocated for advanced DNA testing to quickly and efficiently narrow down suspects in cases with little to no leads. The Bish family, while still mourning the loss of their daughter, have channeled their grief in working towards bettering the actions of law enforcement, and they've made great strides in doing so. The hurt that the Bish family went through when their daughter's criminal wasn't caught, even after almost 2 decades passed, is something that they want to prevent other families from experiencing. And in the end, if nothing else, we can at least be grateful that Molly's name has continued to have a profound impact on our community, and hopefully saved many other families from enduring the same uncertainty and heartache. "13-year-old Bradley Hansen left his home on November 10, 1995, without telling his mother that school had been canceled. Instead, he snuck over to a friend's home and never returned. When trash collectors visited the area later on to empty the bins, workers noticed some concerning evidence inside one of the neighborhood trash cans. But unfortunately, this small amount of evidence wasn't enough to lead to a conviction, at least not yet. But when investigators finally revealed their primary suspect, Bradley's family was shocked because the crime hit much closer to home than any of them could have expected. Bradley Hansen was your average teenage boy growing up in the mid-90s. Being 13, he had just reached the age where he was starting to become interested in finding a girlfriend, and there were plenty of girls his age at his school in Phoenix, Arizona. Bradley was enrolled at Centennial Middle School in Phoenix, where he'd established a core group of friends that he felt he could depend on. One of his closest friends was a kid named Jeremy Bach, and Jeremy and Bradley were pretty much inseparable. The two would often hang out before school started, and they were the first 2 kids to meet up after school had ended, too. It was November of 1995. Brad and Jeremy were speaking sometime earlier that month about Veterans Day, a popular holiday here in the United States. Knowing that the two would be off of school for the holiday, they'd been excitedly planning on what they could do with all their free time. But the crazy thing is, Brad's mother didn't even realize that the children would be out of school for the holiday, and Brad had no plans of telling her. We don't know if he kept this information a secret from his mother because he feared that she may interfere with his plans, or if he simply didn't realize that his mother was unaware of the holiday. But whatever the case was, Brad and Jeremy had quite a day ahead of them. When Veterans Day finally rolled around, it was November 10th, and Brad woke up that morning, got dressed, and prepared for the day as it were any other. He then hopped on a bike that he had borrowed from his neighbor and headed off in the direction of the school. His mother watched him leave and, obviously believing it was a school day, didn't think much else about the situation. But as we know, Brad had no plans of going to school that day. Somewhere along the way, Brad changed course and began heading toward his friend Jeremy's house. It's believed that one of the reasons why Brad was so excited about his plans that day was because a girl named Taylor was expected to show up at Jeremy's house later on that afternoon. Taylor was a friend from school, and if I had to guess, one or both of these boys likely had a bit of a crush on the girl, And considering everyone's parents were at work for the day, you can only imagine what must have been going through these teenagers' minds when Taylor agreed to stop by for a visit. Now, we don't know for sure what the boys had planned on getting up to while they had the entire day to themselves, but the fact that they kept their plans a secret from their parents seems to allude to the idea that they may have been getting up to no good. Now, I can't say this with any certainty, but considering what would take place just a few short hours later, well, this theory may not be as far-fetched as it seems. No sooner than Brad arrived at Jeremy's house, the two ran into Jeremy's stepdad, Daniel, in the kitchen. It seems that Jeremy's dad also didn't realize the boys were off from school for the day, as he claims he was under the impression that the boys would be heading off soon after he left at around 7 a.m. that morning. Needless to say, the boys were over the moon that they had managed to fend off their parents and claim the entire day to themselves, meaning they could do pretty much anything they wanted with no supervision. A scary thing for two teenage boys. But their plans were nearly foiled, because at around 8 a.m., Brad's mom, Rhonda, had a sudden realization that it was Veterans Day. She began paging Brad repeatedly. Mind you, this is 1995, but Brad never responded. She sent him several pages all throughout the day, but Brad simply refused to answer. Rhonda didn't get off of work until 2 p.m. that afternoon, but once she got back home, she still couldn't locate Brad. This was very much unlike him to not respond to his mother's pages and calls. While Brad was your average, reckless teenage boy, he always made sure to stay in touch with his mother, so the fact that he'd suddenly dropped off the map sent every alarm in Rhonda's head ringing. Rhonda reached out to several of her neighbors and friends and tried to determine if anyone had seen Brad that day, but no one had any idea where he may have gone. She even called several of Brad's friends and classmates, but no one reported anything. Rhonda eventually decided to call Jeremy, and that's when things got interesting. Jeremy opened up to Rhonda about what the boys had been up to that morning, but the problem was Jeremy claimed that Brad had left sometime early that morning, but he had no idea where he may have gone. As far as Jeremy knew, he simply hopped on his bike and left, pedaling off into the distance. Rhonda asked Jeremy that if he sees Brad, to let him know that if he's not home by 5 p.m., she'll be calling the police to file a missing person report. Jeremy agreed, and the two hung up the phone. Now, there's some unusual information about what took place immediately after this call with Jeremy. It's been reported that Rhonda decided to call Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, who explained that he'd last seen both of the boys at 7 a.m. that morning. Daniel explained that he'd speak with Jeremy as soon as he got home, and that he would report back with any information he managed to find. But immediately after the call, Rhonda decided that she just couldn't sit around and wait for Brad to show up. She had to do something. Thus, she hopped in her car and started traveling to all of the nearby hangout spots, desperately hoping to find some trace of Brad. But she never did. And later that evening, things took a turn for the worse. Once Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, got off of work later that evening, he spoke with Jeremy just as he said he would. But after the two spoke, for reasons that remain unclear, Daniel never bothered calling Rhonda back. He knew that Rhonda was still actively searching for her missing son, yet never bothered to pick up the phone. When police arrived to take statements from Rhonda, it seems as though they initially classified Brad's disappearance as a runaway case. They didn't know why, but they believed Brad had likely run away from home. But Rhonda didn't believe this to be true. She felt that something terrible had happened to her son, and believed there was no chance he would run away like this. But it seems as though detectives were largely undeterred by her claims, and pushed forward in their own way. When Brad still never returned home that night, Rhonda's fears and concerns began to grow to epic proportions. Police seemed to have requested that Rhonda not go around and investigate her son's disappearance on her own, seemingly for fear of hindering their own investigation. But Rhonda didn't obey their wishes, and she went to the ends of the earth to try to find her boy. She spent the entire weekend speaking to everyone she knew that had ever met Brad, hoping someone had some sort of information, but no one did. That is, except for a couple of Brad's classmates. After Brad had disappeared, there were rumors circulating around the school that something terrible had happened to him. The rumors would suggest that a gunshot had been heard ringing out in the mid-afternoon on the day that Brad went missing. These rumors suggested that Jeremy and Brad had found a weapon inside the home that day, and Jeremy had accidentally fired a single round, which narrowly missed Brad and got lodged into the wall. But these rumors grew far more concerning when it was suggested that Brad was now in possession of the weapon, and he may have planned on using it to end his own life. Now, this may sound like a sudden and unexpected jump in the story, and it certainly is. Rather obviously, up until this point, there had been no reason for anyone to suspect that Brad would have been capable of such a thing, nor was he ever described as being depressed. This only made Rhonda and the police all the more suspicious about these rumors. But the thing is, a rumor has to start somewhere. So it's possible there may have been more truth to this story than anyone else cared to admit. Daniel, Jeremy's stepfather, would call Rhonda sometime around November 13th, about 3 days after Brad had gone missing. During their call, Rhonda opened up about the rumors that she had heard regarding Brad's intentions. Daniel assured Rhonda that these were nothing more than rumors, and even went as far as calling home to his girlfriend, asking her to check and make sure that all of the family's weapons were safely stored away and accounted for. When Daniel's girlfriend Debbie checked the safe, she confirmed everything was in order and nothing was missing. This did a lot to calm the nerves of Rhonda, but in a sense, it also made things worse, because this meant that she was back to square one. This is when Jeremy decided that it was time to speak with Brad's mother personally. Jeremy called Rhonda shortly thereafter and explained everything that had transpired that day. Now, we don't know all the specifics of their call, but Jeremy said that he'd last seen Brad when he left and rode off on the bike that he borrowed from his neighbor. He added that Brad wasn't in the best of moods when he left that day. Jeremy was able to confirm that, as far as he knew, he had been the last person to have seen Brad. But he also added that in the last conversation that he had with Brad, Brad had allegedly claimed that his life, quote, sucked, shortly before pedaling off on his bike. But by the following Monday, when Brad still had not been located, and rumors were beginning to grow far more frequent and far more concerning, the school decided that it was time to get involved. This is when Anne Schelling stepped in. Anne was one of the school's lead administrators, and she spoke with Jeremy twice that day, as well as dozens of other students who had some sort of relation to Brad. Now, according to Anne, she was able to determine that Jeremy, Brad, and Taylor, the female friend who had stopped by, had all been hanging out that day. Now, prior to this, it doesn't seem as though Jeremy had ever mentioned that Taylor had been at the house that day. It seems that this information was first brought up when Anne had spoken with Taylor privately. For whatever reason, Jeremy was doing his best to keep Taylor out of the situation. But now, things had escalated. Anne decided to bring both Taylor and Jeremy into the room at the same time, and that's when Jeremy adapted his story slightly, saying that the two had last seen Brad heading off on his bike, with Brad claiming that he would return in about 10 minutes, but he never came back. This is where things get incredibly interesting, and the story that Jeremy shared with his parents and investigators, well, it began to fall apart. Jeremy knew something about where Brad had gone, but he wasn't willing to let this information slip. Realizing that Taylor and Jeremy had each been telling completely different versions of the story, Anne decided to pull Taylor aside and ask her what had really happened that day. Taylor was incredibly honest, even when she realized that her confession may get Jeremy in a lot of trouble. Taylor admitted that she had made plans with the boys to meet up at Jeremy's house that day. She added that when she arrived, she noticed Brad's bike in the driveway, a fact that didn't align with the story that Jeremy had shared, claiming Brad had already driven off on his bike. But strangely, when she entered the home, Brad was nowhere to be found. She noticed Brad's backpack sitting on the kitchen table alongside his pager, yet Brad wasn't inside the house. When Taylor asked Jeremy where Brad was, Jeremy explained that Brad had left. Taylor obviously didn't believe him. All of his things had been left behind, so where had Brad gone, and why would he leave all of his stuff? Taylor felt that Jeremy was playing some sort of a joke and believed Brad must have been hiding somewhere in the house. But after wandering all throughout the house and calling Brad's name and getting no response, Taylor finally began to believe that Jeremy was telling the truth. But no sooner than she believed him, she began to doubt him once more. That's because, as she wandered into the laundry room, she found Brad's shoes covered in red stains. After finding Brad's shoes, Taylor continued looking around the room and noticed that Brad's t-shirt was in the washing machine. It too had been stained red. But the most concerning detail was that there was a small hole in the front of the shirt. Immediately after, Taylor found a few red drips in the kitchen. When she asked Jeremy what had happened, he explained that he and Brad had gotten into an argument about her. One of the boys had called her a name, and the other boy took issue with that. A fight ensued, and Brad eventually hit Jeremy with a bar stool, causing the hole in his shirt, the red stains, and the spots on the floor. But Jeremy clearly didn't have any wounds on his body. But then Taylor noticed a small hole in the kitchen wall. Jeremy claimed that Brad had grabbed one of the weapons from Jeremy's stepfather's cabinet and fired a single shot. Thankfully, it missed Jeremy, but it left a hole in the wall. Shortly after this is when Brad ran out of the home, claiming that he would be back soon. After Taylor revealed all of this, Anne decided to bring Jeremy back into the room. She asked him about various aspects of Taylor's story, and he finally admitted to nearly all of them. But when she asked about the hole in the kitchen wall, as well as the weapon being fired that day, he denied all of it. Jeremy claimed it was nothing more than a rumor. When Anne reached out to Daniel, Jeremy's stepfather, he stood by his son's claims and insisted that no weapons were used that day, nor was there a hole in the kitchen wall. Police would speak with Jeremy a few weeks later at his school, and Jeremy would alter his story once again, this time claiming that Brad had attacked him with a butter knife before leaving the home and never coming back. Jeremy also added that he believed Brad had run away to Arizona with a man named Poppy, or that he had run away to California to find his dad. He wasn't entirely sure. But the following month, December 15th, Daniel reached out to two detectives who were working Brad's case and asked to speak with them. He explained that Jeremy had finally admitted that he and Brad were playing with the weapon on the day that Brad went missing. He claims that Jeremy came clean and admitted that a single shot had been fired that day. Jeremy even dug the slug out of the kitchen wall and held onto it all this time, with Daniel turning the slug over to investigators for further research. But my question is, if all of this is true, how had Daniel not noticed the hole in the wall until now? When detectives later showed up at the family's home, they asked Jeremy to reenact what had transpired the day that Brad vanished, and he claimed that the two got into an argument and Brad grabbed a weapon, firing a single round at him, which narrowly missed his shoulder. But when detectives took note of the location where Jeremy claimed all of this transpired, they realized how low the hole in the wall was, and there was no way that the slug could have narrowly missed Jeremy's shoulder. It would have gone right through him. When Jeremy was confronted with this evidence, it's reported that he slumped down a bit lower so that the hole in the wall would align more closely with his shoulder. Detectives then realized that there was something fishy going on here. About 3 weeks went by, and this now brings us to January of 1996. The detectives who were working the case had thought long and hard about the situation, and they no longer believed that Brad had run away. They felt that there was much more to this story than Jeremy was willing to admit. They didn't know if Jeremy was guilty of something, or if he was just covering up for his best friend, but they knew something was off. Based purely on a gut feeling, they decided to seize the family's trash can, bringing it in for forensic testing. Now, I've heard one version of the story that claims that the detectives were tipped off by local trash collectors, but other resources claim that the detectives seized the can purely off a gut feeling. I'm not sure which version of events is true, but admittedly it's largely irrelevant to the case. When detectives gained possession of the can, though, they noticed a brown pool in the bottom, as well as some brown drippage on the outside. According to detectives, they believed there was a small chance that this dried liquid may have belonged to Brad. Unfortunately, when samples were taken and compared with Brad's mother, there was a direct link between the two, meaning that whoever the evidence belonged to, they were a direct relative of Rhonda. Around this same time, Jeremy and his mother decided to uproot and move to Las Vegas. The two never explained why they had decided to do this, especially in the middle of an active investigation. But thankfully, police were able to make the proper connections with Arizona police, and they maintained contact with Jeremy, and thankfully so, because in February of 1996, about 4 months after the disappearance of Brad, Jeremy decided that enough was enough. He finally opened up with detectives and confessed what had really taken place that November day. When Jeremy arrived at the police station, he quickly confessed that he and Brad had, in fact, been playing with weapons on the day that Brad was last seen. He says that they'd been playing with multiple weapons when he aimed one at Brad. When he did, he bumped his hand on something, causing him to flinch, and the weapon went off without him ever having his finger on the trigger. The slug struck Brad, but he was still alive. But what's crazy is that Jeremy had begun to panic and clean up the crime scene, leaving Brad there, desperate for help. Jeremy dug the slug out of the wall and tossed it into the trash, along with several cigarette butts that the two had been smoking earlier that day. Now, Jeremy's version of events is incredibly graphic, but based on what he told detectives, Jeremy insists that the whole situation was an accident. He claims the weapon wasn't even cocked when it went off, but this is completely impossible. According to experts, there's a distinct possibility that Brad was alive for an entire hour after the shot had rung out, meaning there was more than enough time for him to have been saved. Yet, because Jeremy panicked, Brad lost his life due to sheer negligence. We don't know if Jeremy was afraid that his parents would find out that they've been playing with weapons, or if he was afraid that he may go to prison. This has never been fully explained. But regardless, Jeremy was too busy cleaning up the scene of the crime and covering up his own mistakes to have taken the time to actually help his best friend survive what was apparently an honest mistake. In the end, Jeremy claims that he hauled Bradley out to the family trash bin and tossed him inside. Bradley would remain in the trash bin for an entire week before trash collectors even dumped the bin. Now, we don't know how they didn't discover Brad's remains inside, but somehow they didn't. In the end, Jeremy was arrested and charged in the second degree. Investigators believe there is zero chance that the weapon went off that day accidentally. After inspecting the weapon, detectives say that there's no possibility a simple bump could have caused the weapon to have been discharged. They believe that the trigger was pulled with intent, even if the demise of Bradley was truly just a mistake. Though many people, including investigators, refuse to believe that this was a mistake at all. The sheer fact that Jeremy went to such great lengths to conceal his wrongdoing suggests there may have been far more to this case than Jeremy is willing to admit. After all was said and done, Jeremy was convicted and sent to prison for 22 years after being tried as an adult, despite only being 13 when the crime was committed. He entered prison in January of 1998 and was set to be released back in December of 2021, meaning he's now a free man. But the main thing about this case that I just can't wrap my head around is, what about Jeremy's parents? Now, I'm not accusing them of anything, that's certainly not my intention, but how could all of this have unfolded without them realizing anything? After all, Jeremy's stepfather, Daniel, claims to have inspected the weapon and even smelled it, yet claimed it had never been fired. He also claimed that all of his ammunition was accounted for, but it couldn't have been, because one round had clearly been fired. He also claims that all of his weapons were locked away in the family's safe. So does that mean Jeremy had a key or a code to the safe? It's certainly possible that he stole the key from his father without him knowing, but that still doesn't explain how his father claimed there was no hole in the kitchen wall when there certainly was. It also doesn't explain how, when Daniel reached out to investigators shortly after the crime, he opened up to them and explained that Jeremy had admitted a weapon had been discharged that day. He even handed in the slug that had allegedly come out of the wall. But this couldn't have been the one that ended Brad's life, because we know that Jeremy had already thrown that one away. So this would mean that a total of 2 rounds had been fired from this weapon, yet Daniel didn't notice the missing ammunition. But if all of this weren't enough, what about the trash bin? Did no one ever take the trash out in the 4 months since Brad had vanished? Surely one of Jeremy's parents would have noticed all the liquid that was in the bottom of the can and dripping down the sides on the outside of the can. Surely someone would have noticed a boy in the bottom of the bin for that first week. Worse yet, surely someone would have smelled something. Now, like I said, I can't with a clear conscience accuse Jeremy's parents of anything, but the whole situation just feels suspicious to me. I hate this so much for Rhonda and the rest of Brad's family. So much more could have been done to save this boy. I even hate it for Jeremy too, because if this was some sort of simple accident or mistake, Jeremy's own panic caused him to lose his best friend and be sent to prison for 22 years, when all of this could have been avoided with a simple phone call for an ambulance. This whole case is just tragic from beginning to end. I just hope that Rhonda was able to make peace with things, even though there's nothing in the world that could bring back her little boy. parenthood teaches a lot of things: compassion, responsibility, and most of all, sacrifice. The safety and well-being of your children is a parent's top priority. Laura Ackerson, a successful businesswoman, was a month away from finally getting full custody of her children, and things were looking up for her. But on the fateful day of July 13th, 2011, Laura was nowhere to be found. Did she abandon her children? And would she really abandon everything and everyone when she was so close to the end of a messy custody battle? Or had something gone terribly wrong? Laura Jean Ackerson was born on April 30th, 1984, to parents Roger and Brenda Ackerson. Growing up, Laura was a cheerful and happy kid with an outgoing and fun personality. She also attended the Grace Fellowship Church with her family and was an absolute sweetheart and gentle soul. Now, not a lot is known about her early childhood, but Laura's perfect family crumbled to bits in 1996. See, her parents couldn't stand each other and constantly fought. And as a result, Laura was just 12 years old when her parents got divorced. The separation was a major blow to Laura's emotional state, and ever since then, she was emotionally insecure. Divorce is something no child should have to go through, and Laura's case makes this particularly obvious. Following the divorce, Laura and her mother Brenda moved to Iowa, and Laura attended Linville-Sully High School, and then attended Kirkwood Community College to study graphic design. Laura had a sharp eye for art and creativity, and she was amazed at expressing herself with different colors, patterns, and digital art. Not long after, Laura moved to Kinston, North Carolina to start fresh, where she attended J.Y. Monk Real Estate School. She started working in marketing and graphic design and also made new friends, specifically in Raleigh, with her business partners Siobhan Moffs and Heidi Shoemaker, who soon became Laura's best friends. Laura loved the fact that she had permanent friends because growing up, she was always alone and didn't have any contact with her old friends since she moved around a lot. She was ecstatic that she'd finally found her tribe. One night at a local restaurant in March of 2007, Laura met a man, Grant Hayes. Grant was born on the 30th of April, 1979 in Raleigh, North Carolina. The fact that Laura and Grant had the same birthday was one of the things that the pair bonded over. Not much is known about Grant's childhood either, but what we do know is that he was religious, had a knack for making music, and became locally famous, working small gigs in bars and restaurants. Grant was a charming guy and knew how to woo the ladies. When he was 18, he graduated high school and met and fell in love with a woman named Emily Lovers. The relationship escalated fast, and before you knew it, they were married. But the marriage fizzled out as quickly as it peaked, and they got divorced, which was a significant point in Grant's life because Emily was his muse. He wrote songs about her and was inspired by their relationship. But when all of that came tumbling down, well, so did Grant. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. He was prescribed very potent drugs like lithium, but soon he started to turn to alcohol and dabbled in much harder substances as well. It was pretty clear that Grant couldn't function without these drugs, and he was already paving his way towards a dark road. But when he got addicted to a synthetic hallucinogen, things only took a turn for the worse. He was already egotistical and narcissistic, but suddenly he got more violent and manipulative. Grant also started to have delusions. He believed that aliens ruled the government and that he was a, quote, chosen one, and that he needed a spaceship to survive the apocalypse. He also didn't believe in vaccination and immunization because he believed they caused autism. I'm gonna love seeing the debates in the comments about this one. Somehow, with all of these delusions and drug abuse, Grant's music career picked up and he got frequent gigs in Raleigh around the same time that he met Laura. But while to the outside world things appeared to be going perfectly for Grant, this was far from the truth, and Laura would soon find herself on the receiving end of Grant's abuse and controlling demeanor. Grant was physically and emotionally abusive towards Laura, and he also repeatedly cheated on her. Laura, already being emotionally insecure, let Grant walk all over her, and he even tried to isolate her from her friends and family, calling them a bad influence. Grant, being a complete textbook narcissist, wanted to control every single thing about Laura, from what she did, where she went, to who she met, everything. Shockingly, despite everything that went down, Laura and Grant got married after just a couple months of dating. Laura, belonging to a broken family and having very tainted experiences with relationships, wanted to find her happily ever after. Still, tragically, she ended up with Grant, a person who didn't think of anyone but himself. To give you an idea about the level of control Grant had over Laura, no one knew that Laura was even in a relationship, and when she broke the news about her being married to Grant, it's safe to say that Heidi and Laura's closest friends got the shock of their lives. But even though it was a horrible idea, Laura's friends supported her along the way. A couple of months after that, Laura fell pregnant. She was deliriously happy about this, and you would think that Grant would be too. But that wasn't the case. Grant hated the idea of becoming a dad. Laura getting pregnant was like adding fuel to the fire, and Grant became even more obsessive and controlling. 9 months later, Grant Jr. was born, and he was everything Laura's world revolved around. And just to further exemplify how narcissistic this man was, he even went as far as giving his son his own name. And don't get me wrong, this isn't done in some narcissistic way. In most cases, it's an endearing tribute to a father or grandfather, but in Grant's case, Regardless, Laura loved her son to pieces, and meanwhile Grant was busy getting high, cheating on the mother of his child, and taking on work gigs, not giving his son any time of day. Eventually, one of Grant's connections told him about a job opportunity in the Virgin Islands. Grant enthusiastically agreed to this opportunity, leaving his wife and infant son back in North Carolina. Now, I don't know about him finding work, but he sure met someone there who kept him busy. A woman, to be exact, and her name was Amanda Perry Tucker. Amanda was a struggling actress and a single mother, having landed a few uncredited roles in movies and TV shows like The Sopranos and Stepford Wives. Grant immediately took a liking to Amanda, mainly because she was wealthy and had almost $200,000 in cash and $80,000 worth of jewelry, possibly as alimony for her prior divorce, but we don't know this for sure. Meanwhile, Grant, at the time of meeting Amanda, was completely broke. The two quickly got into a relationship, and Grant finally had something over Laura that he could rub in her face. He openly cheated on Laura with Amanda, ridiculing her to no end. But Grant couldn't have expected what Laura did next, as she'd finally had enough, something Grant thought would never happen. Laura was fed up and decided to draw the line. She announced that she wanted to leave Grant for good. Grant's own family, and even his ex-wife Emily, sided with Laura, telling her to leave him as soon as possible, as they knew how controlling Grant really was. But Laura found out that she was pregnant with her second child, and even though Grant didn't deserve it, she decided to give him a second chance. But really, this is probably more like Grant's 9th or 10th chance. It goes to show how much Laura adored her children, and was always willing to put them first. It also just goes to show how badly the divorce of Laura's parents must have affected her, as she was now willing to go to the ends of the earth to never become the victim of a divorce for a second time, even if it meant wrecking her own mental health to do it. Understandably, pregnant Laura decided to move to the Virgin Islands with Grant Jr. to be with her husband, a fact that Grant didn't appreciate at all, as she would now have eyes on him 24/7. Fast forward to Laura's second son, Gentle, and he was born. Unfortunately, he had a lot of health issues at birth, and the family needed to be close to a better health facility to monitor him. Ultimately, the Hayes family moved back to North Carolina, and you guessed it, Grant was furious. He blamed everything on Laura and the children, that he lost lucrative work opportunities and that they had forced him to move out of the Virgin Islands. Everything was their fault. All the while, Amanda was still in contact with him, and she even moved to New York and convinced Grant to explore the industry there. We all know by this point that Grant just wanted to be close to Amanda and away from Laura and his children because he didn't want the responsibility. Grant eventually moved to New York, and he loved it there. There was a lot of work for him to get involved in, and he was close to Amanda, which seems to have been priority number one. He even asked Laura if he could take Grant Jr. with him for a diaper photo shoot, promising to return him immediately afterward. Laura was initially hesitant, but she let him go in the end because she wanted the kids to have a good relationship with their father. But little did she know, Grant had other malicious intentions. See, when Grant didn't return Grant Jr. as promised, a concerned Laura checked Facebook, and she was shocked by what she discovered. Grant had married Amanda in New York, married her, and they were living together with Grant Jr. Just let that sink in for a moment. The sheer terror that Laura must have felt in that moment, I can't even fathom. Laura was obviously distraught, and she called Grant to confront him. But she was about to get another incredibly bizarre surprise. Grant revealed to Laura that he and Laura were never legally married to begin with, and when a confused Laura checked her marriage certificate for confirmation, her suspicions became a true nightmare. Grant's signature was missing from the document, and if you thought this was bad enough, there's more. Grant and Amanda had filed for emergency custody of Grant Jr., and since technically Laura and Grant weren't married and there were no custody agreements made beforehand, Laura lost the custody of her 2 children. And get this, all of this happened without Laura even knowing. Grant showed up to these hearings alone and testified that Laura was an unfit mother because she was a full-time mom with no house and no job. The court, without even hearing Laura's side of the story, gave full custody to Grant. It was unbelievable. How could a person take a child away from their mother without so much as hearing the other side of the story? I'm just going to be honest about this. A lot of these cases, they get me a bit worked up. Truthfully, I get pretty emotional when working on nearly every one of these videos, but when hearing what Grant did to Laura, it made me physically sick. But the thing Grant didn't know was that Laura was a fighter, and she was going to do everything to get her kids back. Shortly after, she presented evidence in court that showed that Grant was abusive and a sociopath. Because of these new findings, the court decided to have psychiatric evaluations for both parents. And in the meantime, Laura could have the kids on the weekends, and she could talk to them on the phone every day. But Grant and Amanda, who was pregnant at the time with his child, ruined these precious moments for Laura. They would often interrupt her calls with them, and she barely got more than a couple of minutes to speak to her children throughout the week. Laura was beside herself and overwhelmed, but she still had her best friend Heidi by her side, with whom she shared everything. Laura even shared a very chilling detail with Heidi in the midst of the custody battle, that if anything were to happen to her, it would be Grant's doing. This is terrifying to hear, no matter the circumstance. But remember the psych evaluation ordered by the court? Well, Grant failed it miserably. He had no bond with the kids, and they actually preferred Laura's presence. Go figure. Laura was also shown as a tender and affectionate mother, who always looked out for her boys no matter what. In light of this, the court ordered a detailed evaluation of Grant, and around the same time, Amanda, Grant's new wife, gave birth to a girl, Lillian, on June 9, 2011. Things were eventful as far as the custody was concerned. The court ordered a 3-2 schedule for the parents, in which one parent would get the kids for 3 days, the other would get them for 2 days, and then they would switch up. But to say that Grant was nearing his breaking point by now, well, that's no joke. He became extremely angry and agitated. And soon, very tragically, everything came crashing down. On July 13, 2011, just a month before the next custody hearing, Laura was supposed to have a business meeting with her friend and business partner, Siobhan, later that evening. But she didn't show up or even call. Siobhan thought that this was strange, but decided to let it go because he knew that Laura mentioned that she was going to have to meet with Grant and get her boys at his apartment on that same day. Cell phone records showed that Laura had texted Grant that she was on her way, although she didn't get a reply from him. Anyway, after 5 days of no contact with anyone, 27-year-old Laura was officially reported missing by her friends and family on July 18th. Police officers immediately went to Laura's apartment and found it in ordinary condition. CCTV footage also showed Laura leaving her apartment, but she never returned. They went to Grant and Amanda's apartment in Raleigh next, which was almost 90 minutes away from Laura's, with a search warrant, and they immediately noticed something was very wrong. Not only were Grant and Amanda not home, but upon entering, officers were struck with a very strong smell of bleach, which is never a good sign in a crime investigation. The space was immaculately clean, and officers also noticed some things missing from the apartment. A shower curtain, a vacuum cleaner, and a couple of rugs were missing, and there were bleached patches on the floor too. Police also found 2 pieces of paper, both of which were equally appalling. The first one was a song that Grant was working on, titled Man Killer. The song's lyrics entailed a woman getting brutally killed by strangulation. The other piece of paper was a letter that had Laura's handwriting and signature on it. It was an agreement of sorts between Laura and Grant, and that she would give up custody of her boys for $25,000. Now, this is immediately fishy for anyone who knows Laura, because the kids were her universe, and she would never give them up for money. On top of that, the custody battle had nothing to do with money, at least not for Laura. She truly just wanted her kids with her. The police knew that they needed to track Grant and Amanda down before it was too late. Through CCTV footage, the police found out that Grant and Amanda had been in the midst of a lot of activity after July 13th. Amanda was seen with the kids at a local Chick-fil-A. Meanwhile, Grant went shopping in the early hours of July 14th to a Walmart and a Target in Raleigh. But the things that Grant bought were extremely alarming. He purchased goggles, trash bags, a reciprocating saw, blades, bleach, tape, and a lint roller. Now, I don't know about you, but if this doesn't scream suspicious, I don't know what will. Amanda, on that same day, called her daughter Shaw and told her to take the kids and look after them for a good chunk of the day. Then, on July 16th, Grant made another purchase at a local store, and this time he bought lots of ice and coolers. Shortly after, he rented a U-Haul trailer, and he and Amanda and the two boys went to Richmond, Texas, because Grant wanted to take Amanda for a visit to her sister, Karen Barry. They arrived sometime around July 19th. But interestingly, Grant made yet another purchase at a Home Depot, and he bought heavy-duty gloves and 8 bottles of acid. The police were obviously concerned by all of these details, and they decided to make a trip to Texas to talk to Amanda's sister, Karen. She had a lot of things to say, which further shocked the officers. Karen said that on the night of July 19th, Grant and Amanda had asked her to borrow a boat to go to Oyster Creek, a deep canal with a lot of vegetation, murky waters, and tons of alligators. Karen and her son, Sheldon Barry, also recalled the strange questions that Grant and Amanda asked, like if the alligators of Oyster Creek ate humans, if wild hogs ate human flesh, and if there were bloodthirsty sharks in Texas. Karen and Sheldon chalked these questions up to the morbid curiosity of city folk visiting the countryside. But the police knew that the odds weren't looking good for Laura. Upon hearing this, the police jumped into action. A team was sent to Oyster Creek to look for any evidence, and another team went on to scout for CCTV cameras in Texas, and both hit a jackpot. But sadly, what the police were dreading came true. In Oyster Creek, after hours of treading through murky and dangerous waters with endless lily pads, officers found, well, most of Laura. It's just so tragic and heartbreaking to think that she was going to meet her children, but she fell straight into the hands of such a vicious monster and was dehumanized to the extreme. This vile man literally turned her into fish food. Her remains were so badly damaged that an official cause of death was an uphill task to figure out. But it was eventually concluded that she'd passed away either by manual strangulation or a strong blow to the back of the neck. If you think back to Grant's so-called song that he wrote, everything was just so barbaric, and it proves that Grant had planned on taking Laura's life all along. Chief Deputy Brady, who was on Laura's case, termed the scene as the most gruesome one of his career in 30 years. Police knew for certain that Grant and Amanda were behind the horrific passing of Laura, and their suspicions were solidified on July 20th, 2011. Laura's car, a 2006 white Ford Focus, was discovered near Grant's apartment, parked in a haphazard way. The inside of the car was washed, and there was also damage to the rear end of the car. On top of that, CCTV footage of Amanda dumping bottles of acid near Karen's home was also discovered. On July 25th, 2011, just 13 days after Laura went missing, Grant and Amanda were arrested from Grant's parents' house in North Carolina, and they were charged with taking Laura's life. Grant and Amanda were tried separately, and in true perpetrator-accomplice fashion, both parties turned against each other. Grant said that Laura came to the apartment on July 13th and was apparently threatening Amanda with taking her daughter away, just like how her sons were taken away from her. And that caused Amanda to lash out and attack Laura, ultimately leading to her demise. Grant supposedly only helped to get rid of Laura's body. Meanwhile, Amanda's defense was built on the fact that Grant was very abusive towards her, and she didn't know anything about Laura's passing until they reached Texas. According to Amanda, on July 13th, Laura was visiting Grant and her kids, and during a verbal altercation with Grant, she fell and hit her head. something that Amanda conveniently didn't notice, as she was in the other room with the kids. Anyway, Grant came in and told Amanda that she needed to leave with the children while he could call an ambulance, as Laura was hurt pretty badly. Amanda did as directed and went to Chick-fil-A, and when she came back, Laura was gone and Grant was in the living room. Grant told Amanda that Laura was fine and didn't need an ambulance after all, and that she just went home. Fast forward to the couple reaching Texas, and Grant confessed to Amanda that Laura had indeed passed away. Grant then proceeded to threaten Amanda to help him dispose of Laura's body, to which she agreed because, well, she was afraid of him. Both Grant and Amanda pleaded not guilty, but there was an overwhelming amount of evidence against them, and finally they were both found guilty and both convicted. On September 16, 2013, Grant was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What's so eerie and disgusting is the fact that Grant showed no remorse for heartlessly attacking Laura and taking her life, and he was all smiles in court. It was as if nothing had even happened, almost like he was preparing to go away on a vacation or something. This man he doesn't even make any sense. After a few months, on February 19, 2014, Amanda was sentenced to 13 to 16 years. At the sentencing, the judge had a very valid opinion about Amanda and her hand in Laura's passing. He said, quote, "I personally believe, based on my view of the evidence, that it's quite possible and likely that Amanda Hayes could have saved the life of Laura Ackerson, and she chose not to. She chose instead to participate in her killing." Amanda, at the sentencing, was remorseful, but it could have just been her acting skills coming forward, because she had every chance to prevent the brutality that Laura went through. But she didn't stop anything. But the thing is, the prosecution was nowhere near done, because Amanda was tried again in Texas for tampering with evidence, and she was given an additional 20 years in prison. Now, the question was, how did the deadly duo actually attack Laura that led to her passing? And what was the reason? Police believe that Laura was lured into Grant and Amanda's apartment on the pretense that she would get to meet her children. It's also believed that Grant lied to Laura about giving her full custody of the children. See, Laura would have never met Grant alone under any circumstances, and even her friends forbade her from doing so. So the only plausible reason as to why she was willing to take a 90-minute trip from Kingston to meet Grant was to see her kids. It's just so heartbreaking now to see how excited Laura was to meet her kids, and she had no clue that Grant had no intentions of letting her leave alive. But what about the letter that was in Laura's handwriting about handing over the custody to Grant? Well, it's believed that once Laura reached the apartment, she was subdued by Grant and Amanda and forced to write the letter and even sign it. Grant probably threatened Laura that if she didn't do what he said, then she would never see her sons again. After writing the letter, she was very tragically attacked, but this is more or less just a theory. We don't know that this is what happened for sure. All we know is that Grant seems to have been doing all of this so that he could take Laura out of the picture for good and begin his new life with Amanda. But that's where things get even worse. After all of this, in October of 2014, Amanda and Grant got divorced. For Grant, all of his trouble, all of this effort, it had now been for nothing. Laura's two sons, Grant Jr. and Gentle, along with Amanda's daughter Lillian, are now in the care of Grant's parents, who are every bit of loving and caring, unlike their father was. It's so sad to see that the two boys were robbed of their mother at such young ages, much less by their father and his manipulative ways. Laura, even after her parents got divorced, was still in contact with her father Roger and her brother Jason. Roger wished that he could have given a better life to Laura, and because of his and Laura's mother's rocky relationship, Laura never truly got to know what love was and was trapped with a narcissistic monster. Roger, after multiple failed marriages, suffered from tremendous heartache, and to see his youngest daughter pass away in such a tragic and devastating way was just unbearable. Roger spent his days in his busy antique store, Collector's Corner Shop, in the historic district of Lowell, where he envisioned Laura as the marketing director of the business if she'd been alive and well, but those dreams were eventually taken away from him. While trying to get custody of Grant Jr. and Gentle, Roger, at the age of 75, unfortunately passed away on February 18, 2021. This case was heinous on so many levels. Laura, a loving mom, responsible daughter, and devoted friend, was so full of life and so sweet and caring, yet she was taken away so savagely by the father of her own children. It goes to show just how important self-respect is in a person's life. You should never be afraid of standing up for yourself. Don't let yourself be a doormat for others, no matter how much you may love them. It's never too early to start with a clean slate, but unfortunately for Laura, she was just too late. Many young people have made the move to Los Angeles with dreams of making a name for themselves in film, despite the chances of those plans being realized being very low. Those who succeed usually go on to enjoy a prosperous and fulfilling career, but those who fail are either forced to return to their hometowns or keep trying in hopes that one day they'll get their big break. 21-year-old Juliana Redding was one such aspiring actress who'd moved from Arizona to Santa Monica in 2005. But her story would have a tragic ending with many twists and turns along the way. It's a case that's resulted in many people questioning whether justice was served, since the outcome was not what anyone expected. And today, Juliana's family must live with the knowledge that the criminal who took her life may never face the consequences of their heinous actions. Juliana grew up in Tucson, Arizona, where she attended South Point Catholic High School, and by all accounts, she had a great childhood. She was close with her family, and after graduating, she decided to move to California, as she had aspirations of becoming a model. But her real ambition was to own her own business one day, and she told her parents, Patricia and Greg, that she would like to open a boutique in the future. After arriving in Los Angeles, she kept in touch with her family on a regular basis. She would often call her parents and catch up and let them know how her plans were going. They would also text each other often, and on occasion, she would make the trip back to Tucson for a visit. By 2008, she was living alone in a bungalow in Santa Monica while she was studying at Santa Monica College. To make extra money, she worked as a hostess in a restaurant while looking for opportunities in modeling or acting. For the time being, Juliana seemed content with her situation. But all of that would change on the 16th of March of that year, when Patricia found out that she couldn't make contact with her daughter. What's known is that Juliana played a round of golf on the 15th of March, after which she returned to her bungalow and opted to spend the night in, watching TV, specifically Seinfeld reruns. The following evening, Patricia became increasingly concerned when she received a call from Juliana's neighbors, who informed her that they hadn't seen her at all that day, and her dog was seen inside her bungalow, but the place seemed completely deserted. Patricia repeatedly dialed her number in hopes that she would answer, but she never did, and also never returned any of her mother's calls. At first, she thought she may just be busy, but when she hadn't received a reply by 6 p.m., she knew something wasn't right. It was then that she decided it was time to call the police. Patricia explained the situation to investigators and asked whether they could do a welfare check, to which they agreed. Officers traveled to the bungalow and looked around outside, but saw nothing out of place or suspicious. Her car was still parked in the driveway, which suggested that she should be home, but the bungalow was silent. But when they entered the building, they knew something strange had happened. They noticed a candle burning in the bungalow's main entrance, and then immediately detected the odor of natural gas, which they then discovered was coming from the gas stove that had been left on, but the burner wasn't lit, meaning the entire room was now essentially a time bomb. Then they made an even more unsettling discovery. After searching through the house, they walked into the back bedroom, and here they found Juliana. Unfortunately, she was no longer alive. It didn't take detectives long at all to realize that she'd been strangled, but it was also obvious that she'd put up quite a fight against her attacker. From all indications, it seemed that a violent struggle had taken place throughout the apartment. This theory was confirmed when it was revealed that Juliana's DNA was present under her own fingernails, suggesting that she was attempting to remove her attacker's hands from her throat. There were very few clues as to who had ended her life, but one thing that was certain was whoever entered the apartment had plans to cover their tracks by blowing up the apartment. They'd hoped that the gas emanating from the stove would react with the lit candle, thereby creating an explosion that would have wiped out a lot of evidence at the scene. It's believed that thanks to the age of the building, the gas never had a chance to build up enough to cause an explosion. And before long, investigators started to piece together what they believed happened in the moments leading up to Juliana's death. They believed someone entered the bungalow at around 10 p.m. on the night of the 15th of March. After gaining entry, they attacked Juliana, and at some point had caused injuries to her head by hitting her against the floor. Since this was a prolonged attack, investigators believed that her assailant didn't expect her to put up such a fight, and in the end, they had to resort to strangulation. It would later be determined that Juliana attempted to contact emergency services at some point, as her phone records showed that she dialed 911, but the call ended before it could connect. The neighbors who'd contacted Patricia told officers that they heard the sounds of furniture being moved around and someone screaming at about 9:53 the previous night, but added that they hadn't seen anyone suspicious in or around the building. And it's certainly a shame they didn't take the situation more seriously, but you can't really blame them too much. Like they said, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and it could have been a small party or something for all they knew. Evidence was collected from the scene of the crime, including several DNA samples that were found on the building's front door, the phone, Juliana's clothing, and on her throat. These samples were sent into a lab for analysis, but they would take some time to reveal who'd been inside her apartment. In the meantime, investigators interviewed Juliana's family and friends, who gave them as many details about her life as they could. When speaking to crime scene experts, Juliana's father suggested that they contact a man named John Gilmore, with whom Juliana had been in an on-again, off-again relationship. He added that he was concerned about Juliana when he found out they were dating, since Gilmore was known to have had a violent temper, which became all the more apparent when he kicked in her car door on one occasion, and had also forced his way into her apartment. When investigators heard this news, they felt like they finally found the lead they'd been hoping for. They immediately set out to locate John, and it didn't take long at all before they found their man. When John Gilmore was interviewed, he stated that he'd been to Juliana's place that Sunday morning, but got no answer at the door, despite her car being parked in the driveway. He looked in through the security gate, but could only see the burning candle, though he'd never smelled any gas. When asked about the violent incidents that they'd been told about, he admitted that he and Juliana had on occasion gotten into fights, one of which took place that Saturday night when they started arguing about his plans for the evening. He'd called her to tell her that he was planning on spending some time with some of his friends that night, and this must have irked her, since she abruptly ended the call. He claimed that she then decided to spend the evening with one of her own friends, and he ended up going to a house party at a residence a few miles from her apartment. While there was still some tension between them, they kept texting each other throughout the evening. But then at around 10 p.m., she stopped responding to his messages. When he still hadn't received any reply the following morning, he attempted to call her and sent several text messages, but again he got no response. This is when he went to her building, but had no choice other than to leave when he couldn't find her there. While he was certainly the first suspect, his name was soon cleared thanks to surveillance footage from the night of the attack. Security camera footage showed him visiting a convenience store and a Jack in the Box restaurant. Several people from the house party were able to confirm that he was there when the attack took place, since they saw him there between 9:45 and 10:15 p.m. His innocence was fully confirmed when it was revealed that much of the DNA found in the apartment belonged to a woman, not a man. And police now had a lot of unanswered questions. They then started the task of speaking to all of the women in Juliana's life. There was suspicion that someone who knew her might have become jealous of her looks or her lifestyle, or that there was some sort of love triangle involved. Investigators collected DNA samples from everyone they spoke to, but this led nowhere, as no match was found for the samples that had been removed from her apartment. This is when they discovered that there was another man in the picture, a doctor by the name of Munir. Upon further investigation and questioning, investigators learned that Juliana and Munir had met each other while she was employed at a restaurant in 2007. She must have made quite an impression on him, since he offered her a job as a medical assistant and she readily agreed. Working as a hostess or a waitress in a restaurant obviously doesn't pay very well, at least not considering all the crap you have to deal with from patrons, and she must have jumped at the opportunity to earn a little more money. But their relationship wouldn't remain merely professional for long. Before too much time had passed, she agreed to move in with Munir, and during this time Munir would bring her gifts and allow her to live in his upscale house that was located in Beverly Hills. While this notion must have been flattering for a while, it didn't take long for Juliana to become concerned about Munir's behavior, as she started feeling as though he was obsessed with her. He told her that he wanted to buy her an expensive car when she turned 21, and at one stage he even suggested that they get married. There was no doubt that she would be left wanting for nothing, since he was a very wealthy man, but he was known to waste money on jewelry, cars, and women, which she found overwhelming and somewhat concerning. It's unclear if Munir simply got the wrong message from Juliana, or if he was making things out to be much more than they really were, almost some sort of delusional wishful thinking. But whatever the case, Munir's behavior only got stranger and stranger from here, and it didn't take Juliana long to realize she needed a way out. Juliana eventually got her wits about her and decided she needed to end the relationship with Munir, after which she relocated to the bungalow in Santa Monica, which was being paid for by her father. The pair parted ways on good terms, and they even stayed in touch, which is a little bit surprising. One of Juliana's friends would later reveal that she, Juliana, and Munir traveled to Las Vegas on one occasion to celebrate her friend's birthday. But all was not as it seemed, as her father started looking into Munir's background, and what he found was seriously startling. He discovered that Munir not only was married at the time of his supposed relationship with Juliana, but that he had 3 children who were living in Lebanon. He was certain that his family didn't know about Juliana or any of the other women that he'd been seen with, and so he relayed what he'd found to his daughter. She was taken aback and upset by the news, and immediately told him that she no longer wanted to see him, and she even told him to never speak to her again, which was probably the right move. While Juliana and Munir were no longer on good terms, her father, Greg, who was a pharmacist, still kept in touch with Munir, since they'd been working on a business deal together, but it never came to fruition as the deal fell through after Greg became concerned that Munir was running his business somewhat illegally. Evidence was quickly beginning to stack up against this man, and it quickly became clear he simply wasn't the man he portrayed himself to be. Investigators found it strange that Juliana had her life ended just a week after this deal had gone sour, and they soon started suspecting that Munir knew much more than he was letting on. But bear in mind, his DNA was not found at the scene of the crime. They were unable to interview him at the time, since he'd left the country, go figure, but they decided to start digging into his past in the meantime. Since he was known to have had a somewhat sordid history with women, they started looking at the women who'd worked for him in the past. They had a suspicion that the female DNA found at the crime scene may somehow be connected to Munir, but they had no proof to confirm these suspicions. Most of his former female employees were either no longer in touch with him or had no knowledge of Juliana. But when they looked into the history between him and a 47-year-old woman named Kelly Sue Park, they started to grow even more suspicious. He'd made several substantial payments to her, totaling over $1 million in just 18 months. She'd been involved in several of his business deals in the past while she was working as a real estate broker. While they were by no means certain that Park was connected to the attack on Juliana, they decided to have her followed in hopes that they could collect a DNA sample without her knowledge. If she was somehow connected to the crime, she may have alerted Munir to the fact that the authorities wanted to collect her DNA, and so it was decided that this should be done without raising any suspicions. Their patience eventually paid off when they were able to collect one of her discarded cigarette butts, and it was sent away to be analyzed. Before long, investigators were informed that they'd finally made a breakthrough in the case, as it was found that Park's DNA was a perfect match for the samples collected from Juliana's bungalow. There was now no doubt that Park was present when the attack was carried out, and there was a good chance that Munir was involved somehow, though he still hadn't returned to the US and so couldn't be questioned yet. Obviously, Park was apprehended and immediately charged with the crime against Juliana. It's believed that Munir found out about her arrest just a few days later, since he suddenly vanished into thin air, though it's believed at the time he was likely somewhere in Lebanon, possibly to avoid being tracked down by the police. The only problem was, the motive for Juliana's crime was still unclear. It was suggested that Munir didn't take kindly to their relationship coming to an end, or that he'd gotten upset when his business deal with her father fell through. So it was theorized that he'd hired Park to carry out the attack in retaliation. One of the most widely accepted theories was that Munir had instructed Park to intimidate Greg into accepting the deal they were working on, and that as part of this intimidation, she was to pay an unfriendly visit to Juliana in her apartment. But when Juliana started fighting back, Park was taken by surprise, and she ended up ending her life as the two women struggled for survival, though this was still just a theory. This would be a point that was brought up in court later on, as it was argued that Munir agreed to pay Park a six-figure sum to follow through with his plan. When news of Park's arrest made it to the media, the LA Times published details revealing that she was known to have had intimidated people in the past whenever they went against Munir's business plans. So it made sense that she may have been involved this time as well. On one occasion, she intimidated a bank manager who had also canceled a deal. And on another, she was told to intimidate one of his clients who'd failed to keep up with his payments as promised. But despite the wealth of evidence found in Juliana's bungalow, and DNA placing her at the scene, Park decided to plead not guilty to second-degree homicide charges. Her defense attorneys revealed that they would be willing to tell the court that the two women never met each other, and that the only connection between them was Munir, who was still out of the country. The prosecution, on the other hand, intended to reveal that Park had been hired by Munir as an enforcer, and that her attempt at intimidation ultimately led to Juliana's life being ended. But this didn't have the intended effect. The judge in this case ruled that this theory could not be used during the trial, since there was no solid evidence to back it up, and instead the state would have to rely on evidence found at the scene, including the DNA that was matched to Park. They would also mention the fact that Park stood nearly 6 feet tall, and that she was an intimidating and self-assured woman who could easily fulfill the role of an enforcer or intimidator if Munir ordered her to do so. This woman was genuinely scary to be around, and she apparently just had a personality and energy about her that was just difficult to get past. The evidence against Park had mounted, and it seemed all but certain that she would be found guilty of ending Juliana's life. Her DNA had been found in several places in the apartment, including on Juliana's clothes, inside the locks on the front door, on the telephone, and most incriminating of all, on her throat. On a plate that had been left in the kitchen sink, crime scene investigators found a drop of blood along with a fingerprint that belonged to Park. This, according to the prosecution, was undeniable proof that Park was inside the apartment that night, and since the two women didn't know each other, she would have no reason to be there, other than to carry out an attack as ordered by Munir. Furthermore, they believed it was indisputable that she had ended her life since her DNA was found on her throat, indicating that Park was the one who ended her life via manual strangulation. But pinning this woman for such a crime was much easier said than done. She wasn't going down without a fight, much like the night that she encountered Juliana in her apartment. Her defense team had more than a few tricks up their sleeve, and they were willing to pull out all the stops to get Park off the hook. Kelly Park's defense team had a different theory that they claimed cast doubt on the suggestion that she was in the apartment with Juliana on the night of the crime. Since there were no witnesses that night, they contended that there was too much uncertainty as to what had transpired, and furthermore, they theorized that Park's DNA could have ended up in the building through DNA transfer. This occurs when someone touches an item belonging to someone else, and that item is then found at a crime scene, resulting in an innocent person being suspected of a crime when it's discovered that their DNA is present. Another example of this is when an item is touched by two people, resulting in DNA from one person being transferred to the other. In other words, Park may have touched an item that was also touched by Juliana's killer, and they then unwittingly transferred her DNA to the crime scene. In this case, they made reference to a towel that was possibly used by Park when she was in Munir's Beverly Hills home 5 months earlier. They suggested that the killer committed the crime and then attempted to remove their fingerprints and DNA with the use of that same towel, transferring Park's DNA to the scene in the process. They mentioned that Park would have visited this house on several occasions since she was known to be a business associate of his, and since Juliana had lived in that same house at some point, Park's DNA might have inadvertently been transferred to Juliana's bungalow. When discussing Munir's role in the crime, the defense argued that a failed business deal with Juliana's father didn't seem like strong enough motive to have her life ended, and neither was the fact that she had ended their relationship. As for the large amount of money that was transferred from Munir into Park's bank account, they argued that these were simply payments that were owed to her, since she and Munir were known to have conducted business with each other. The prosecution revealed to the court that Munir had, in the past, boasted that he employed a woman who was the female equivalent of James Bond, and they built their case around the suggestion that she was paid to work as an assassin, and that Munir had more than enough motive to order a hit on Juliana. The case was just getting wilder and wilder, and some aspects of the court proceedings are just downright unbelievable. The LA Times reported that Park's telephone records showed that she called Juliana's place of work, and that she was present outside her bungalow the night before the attack was carried out. Since they had never met, there could only be one reason for Park to try and contact her: to figure out her schedule and to stake out her apartment while planning the attack. It was also alleged that Park and Munir had collaborated on a health insurance fraud scam, and that at the time it was still being investigated by authorities. The trial would last until 2013, an incredibly long time. But the verdict the jury reached on behalf of Park, it shocked everyone. After all the court proceedings had been carried out, the jury found Kelly Sue Park not guilty. Juliana's friends and family members who were present at the proceedings were outraged at the verdict and made their feelings known, shouting that she knew she was guilty and that something had gone terribly wrong while she was being led out of the courtroom. This meant that no one would be held accountable for the loss of Juliana's life, and that the one man connected to everyone involved in the case would not even be questioned since he couldn't be reached. This verdict, for all the painfully obvious reasons, must have had a devastating effect on her family, who only commented on the outcome via a written statement, in which they expressed their sadness and shock at the fact that justice had never been served. Worse yet, Lebanon doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States, and the country does everything it can to protect its own citizens, meaning that as long as Munir stays put, he'll never face judgment for his actions. They found it unbelievable that the massive amount of evidence against Park and Munir wasn't enough to see them convicted. They've done their best to come to terms with the decision, and her mother, Patricia, now uses her daughter's room when she paints, helping her feel some small level of connection to her daughter, even after all these years have passed. She says that she's resorted to using art as a coping mechanism, since she produces her best work when she's emotional. At times, she feels as though she and Greg, along with their son Patrick, are still stuck in 2008 when the attack took place, since they still find it hard to believe that Park and Munir walked away scot-free. But thankfully, she's found new meaning in her life, since she remembers her daughter through her art, and after overcoming breast cancer, she started looking for the positive aspects of any obstacles she faces. As for Munir, it's believed that he joined his actual family in Lebanon after fleeing from the US, and today he still maintains he's innocent in the matter. He's never been charged or even questioned. He was placed under arrest in Germany in 2015, when it was suspected that he was committing medical fraud, but nothing ever came of this. It's alleged that he allowed a physician's assistant who had never attended medical school to perform surgeries when his patients were assured that he would be the one to perform the surgeries. More than 20 of his patients have come forward to report that they've been left with permanent damage as a result. For reasons unknown, he was released and then traveled to Lebanon once again, where he was again suspected of committing medical fraud. Park was also arrested in 2015 in the German case, when it was found that she was involved. She was charged with conspiracy, lying to patients, disfiguring patients and botched surgeries, and cheating insurance companies out of $150 million. She was eventually released on $1.5 million bail, and once again managed to slip out of the grasp of police. Juliana's case is one with no happy ending and no easy answers. Her family did their best to protect her from Munir when it became apparent that he was living a double life, but in the end, he walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist. Some may consider this to be an unsolved case, but I think we all know the truth here. Sometimes the justice system simply fails those who trust that due process will prevail, no matter the amount of solid evidence that's presented. One can only hope that lessons are learned from this case, in hopes that similar failures don't become commonplace in the future. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's currently the best way you can help support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate those of you who have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video, or find the link down in the description. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered, and don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.